All right. So, in prep for today, I read a biography of Robbie Williams called Facing the Ghosts. And Robbie's story is one of a lost adolescence, control, creativity, fame, drugs, alcohol, and paparazzi. So, all the necessary ingredients for a pop star turned rock star. So, let's take it all the way back to the beginning, February 13th, 1974, because that is the birthday of Robert Peter Williams. Robert was born in Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire, England, to father Pete and mother Janet. Now, I'm going to spend a little time on his father because I think the apple didn't fall too far from the tree here. So I think there's I think it's interesting to see the like father, like son dynamic here.
Did
He
his
doesn't have
father
the. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
did his father also shave a little wine out of his eyebrow?
Oh, I was gonna ask if his dad had like one of those stereotypical British jobs you always make fun of, like he was like a lorry driver and his mom,
He's a chimney
like
sweep.
yeah, exactly.
So Pete is Rob's father. He started his adult life as a cop and got married at 21 years old. But that first marriage only lasted 2 years because Pete had joined a local swimming team, which was the code he and his buddies used for their elaborate scheme to sneak out and party in Manchester and cheat on their wives. So Pete gets a job at an English electric factory or at English Electric. I don't know what that is, if that's a utility company or if they're making electric. I don't know. But either way, he meets Janet, who he would marry in
That's kind of what the
1970.
utility company does, Adam. They make electric.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
But are you implying that he's like running on a hamster wheel to
Right.
like
That's
generate
my thought. Is
electricity?
he's
Yes.
making the electricity.
Wow, this is pre-industrial revolution.
Well, it was England in the 70s. So Pete realizes that working is for the birds, and he instead wants to get into show business. So he adopts the stage name of Pete Conway to pursue his show business dreams. Now, I'm sure I'm not going to surprise anyone when I say that sometimes showbiz can make life tough for a married couple, and his pursuit of his dreams led to his first marriage falling apart. No big surprise there. But he manages to somehow keep the second one going for a bit. Stand by. So, Rob's dad is working in the cabaret scene in England. And he wasn't home very much. He would spend the time that he was
such a
home
horn dog.
gambling. You're
Great. He's such a horn dog. He's like, oh, you get a job in the cabaret scene. This is going to keep my second marriage together.
well, they called it the cabaret scene. I think it's more like dinner theater.
Yeah, it's like
club, right? Yeah,
it's like nightclubs for middle-aged people.
Yes,
But
exactly.
I imagine there's probably still pretty rich hunting grounds for a divorced dad with a good job.
So it sounds like his father was a big fish in a little pond, right? A nightclub singer, but the type of gregarious guy who was always running for mayor wherever he went. He made a living telling jokes, singing, dancing, and in 1980s man perm and a dinner jacket. And I loved hearing about some of these gigs that he would do. And this truly sounds terrible. There was one gig at a supper club that held Christmas and New Year's parties every weekend from October through January. So people would come on a Friday night and they would celebrate Christmas with the full trimmings and everybody singing Christmas songs. And then Saturday was a New Year's Eve celebration.
Wow.
And he had to do that for 2 months straight. That's
where we're going with this one, right? That's totally TGI McScratchies. Every day is New Year's Eve. Oh my God, the level of alcoholism that staff must have had.
Accurate. But Pete was doing gigs to a couple thousand people a night, it sounds like. And he won some local talent shows and even announced Robert's birth on local English television. But he's a road dog and a man's got to ramble. So his wife, Janet, is trying to convince him to settle down. And she's hatched a plan for him to buy a local pub called Red Lion in 1975, hoping that would ground him and keep him home. And the pub did decent business because Pete was a minor local celebrity. But one day in 1977, he woke up, he went to the FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium, and just never went home. He was quoted as saying later on in life, "This is what freedom's like, and I decided I wasn't going back." Father of the year.
Yeah. And his
So
son didn't turn out to be
it's
completely
crazy,
normal and
right?
well adjusted and have good boundaries with substances and whatnot. Yeah.
Women, yeah. So he leaves behind a 3.5-year-old Robert with Jan. And in addition to a broken family, his father also left Robert with a look at me syndrome that would follow him his whole life. Robert always needed people to be impressed by him, no doubt because no one at home was paying attention to him. But young Rob showed a real knack for performing at a pretty young age. And according to Rob, he before he could talk, he could sing, and found that if he did, people would smile and pay him attention. So at age 3, he wins his first talent show doing a John Travolta impression. His,
Would that be which John Travolta do you think that would be? That would be
this
Barbarino?
this is singing Summer Nights from Greece.
Ah, oh,
Okay,
of course.
okay.
Yes, all right.
I have to say, I always am very highly suspect when people are like, I have this very clear memory from before I could talk. No, you don't.
No,
I'm
you
sorry.
don't.
You don't have a clear memory of the reaction that adults were giving you when you were 2.5 years old. Or maybe you didn't talk until you were like really old or something like that. But that's a whole other problem.
I talked at 10, so I was performing at 9.
Yeah.
So his father Pete does eventually come back into his life, albeit intermittently, but he is still living the life of a full-time performer.
Can I take a
And-
guess as to when Pete comes back into his life? Is it when the first royalty check arrives? Is that when he comes back into his life?
Before that, actually.
Oh, yeah. So he is a
So,
good dad. Okay.
During summers, since he was out of school, Robert would spend a lot of time on the road with his dad, traveling around to the East Coast resorts of England, watching his father perform night after night. And his mother eventually arranged for him to be a model for children's fashion and bridal shows. He's definitely being indoctrinated into the showbiz life here. At 8 years old, he was modeling. At 9, he was landing acting roles in local stage shows. At age 11, he landed the role of the fiddler in the musical production Fiddler on the Roof in some local production. At age 13, he was in a Charles Dickens play, kept getting better and better gigs until school kind of just became nothing. He just went there for a laugh. Yeah, remember school? Kids are supposed to do that. Well, it wasn't really for him. And he had a couple teachers who told him he was going nowhere. And in a quick nod to Robin Williams mentioned at the top, the author of the book I read said, forget teachers who inspire. The ones who provoke children or willfully underestimate and stifle children, those are the ones who inspire kids to spend the rest of their lives working their asses off just to give a big F you to the people who wrote them off. So
Amen.
write a letter to your worst teacher sometime.
Was that a backhanded reference to Dead Poets Society, or what are we talking about here?
Yes. Yeah, that was
Okay,
my
all right.
attempt at a Dead Poets
Because
Society.
your earlier topical Robin Williams reference was Mork and Mindy. I mean, what's the Venn diagram of Robbie Williams knowledge and Mork and Mindy watching?
I have a question for the group here. I keep hearing about all his modeling gigs, and he's kind of like a heartthrob. I don't think he's a particularly good-looking guy. Like, I don't look at him and be like, oh, striking. I imagine when he walks into a room, everyone's like, oh my God, who is that? He kind of looks like a just normal ass dude, right?
I disagree. I think he's quite striking looking.
Okay. Well,
It's
you
the
know,
eyes.
no accounting for taste, I
He's got-
guess.
Well, I mean,
piercing
what do we
eyes.
know collectively? But I mean, he's got the square jaw. I mean, I'm talking about him as a young man. I think he's a looker.
Yeah. All right. We know Rob's type now. Okay.
Whereas that Gosling fella, you know, he doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah. Yeah. He's
So-
total Monet.
So Robert leaves high school without graduating at the age of 16. So fresh out of school, Rob tries to get a job selling windows, and that goes nowhere. But the showbiz bug definitely bit him, and he wanted more.
Hold on.
And it kind of
Are you allowed to say fresh out of school if you didn't graduate? Is that fair?
that's a good point. I don't
Well,
know.
if he's not in school, then he must be out of school.
He's
Yeah,
definitely out,
yeah.
but I don't know about the fresh part. That seems misleading.
As in, he walked out of the building recently.
He's like at a job interview. He's like, I'm fresh out of school. Did you graduate or not, sir?
Answer the question. So it sounds like his mom was kind of a showbiz mom too and wanted him to be famous, maybe more than he did. But his mother sees a newspaper ad in The Sun And the ad was seeking a fifth member of a band being put together by an impresario. Vocab word: an impresario is a person who organizes plays, operas, and performances. I did not know that word. That was a new word for me. Anyway, this guy is named Nigel Martin Smith, and the group was called Kick It. Now, the year is 1990. I was 10 years old, and just a quick reminder of where we are in the USA musically in 1990. The top songs of the year were Wilson Phillips' Hold On, It
Banger.
Must Have Been Love by Roxette. God, what
Kind of
great
also a banger.
song. And of course, Poison by Belle Biv DeVoe.
3 bangers. I gotta
I
say,
know,
pretty
right?
Good.
Hold on a second, but you do realize your reading of the band name was exactly the same as the Beastie Boys' "Fight for Your Right to Party" kick in, right?
It has infected my
He's trying to
brain.
give it some credibility.
Exactly.
I don't know if there's any bringing credibility to that.
All right. Now, this guy, Nigel Martin Smith, was no stranger to the music industry. He had 30 years under his belt as a guitarist and composer with bands like King Crimson and Yes. And I'm kidding, he ran a modeling agency in Manchester.
Yeah, you actually had me there for a second. I was like, wow, that's quite a right turn.
So his big original idea was to create a British version of the New Kids on the Block. His vision for this band was single, hyper-focused goal of making as much money as possible in the shortest time possible. Artistic integrity in its highest form.
Well, don't forget exploiting basically children as well. That's a huge component of this.
Yeah, that's going to come up in a minute. Yeah, right. So Janet, his mom, it's still friendly, it sounds like, with her husband, Pete. And so she uses Pete's connections in the music industry to somehow get Rob an audition. And that is really when he changed from Robert Pete Williams to Robbie Williams. You got to get that stage name in early. So Robbie does the audition and he lands the gig. Robbie is thrilled. His mom is thrilled, but the journey is not going to be a cakewalk. There were already a bunch of There's already a bunch of stipulations imposed by their manager, Nigel. He let them know right up front they would make a ton of money, but nothing would be allowed to damage their carefully curated image. No girlfriends, no drinking, no smoking, no drugs. Stay out of the tabloids.
That really
And I'm
sounds
already
like
laughing because that's, yeah.
that sounds like the modern day K-pop machine, where they have those stars that they create. What are the idols that they create? But they are hyper manufactured in terms of their public persona, and they've had to issue apologies because they've been seen holding hands with their boyfriend in public and stuff like that. I mean, it's a tried and true way to make
Well,
money.
We just covered the Monkees like a couple weeks ago, and that was hugely successful. They didn't have the bright idea to put them in a house together, in a dormitory together, and tightly control their activities, right?
Yeah, but Robbie Williams was also the Artful Dodger, much like Davy Jones was in Oliver. So
Nice.
That-
And as we
yeah.
learned on the Monkees episode, a young Phil Collins.
yes.
Well, now I need to go back and listen to that episode. All right. So the leader of the band at that time, was a guy named Gary Barlow, who had already written and released some pop songs. He was 19. The other guys in the quote band were Mark Owen, who was 18, Howard Donald, who was 22, Jason Orange, who was 20, and Robbie Williams, who was the baby at 16. In later interviews, Nigel Martin Smith would admit that he picked Robbie to join the group, not necessarily because of his dancing skills or even his voice, but because he added a bit of personality, kind of a cheeky attitude that was amazing on stage, and of course would be the ultimate downfall of the band, as we'll see. All right. So with the band assembled, they need the right image. And you may not have Googled these guys yet, but if you Google "Take That Leather," you'll see an early incarnation of the band. Think Village People, but they're all a bunch of ripped, young, attractive English guys. So it turns out that their manager, Nigel, was actually pitching the band at the gay audiences in England. Nigel himself was gay. He wanted to create some ambiguity to appeal to both straight young girls, but also gay men. There wasn't a ton of ambiguity. And in fact, most of their early gigs were on the gay club scene in England.
There's no ambiguity in the promo shot I'm looking at.
No. Yeah. It's
Now,
a choice.
Now, at this point in my week of research with a completely unknown band, I went and watched the video for their first single called Do What You Like. It's pretty gay. I mean, like homoerotic.
Yes.
They're all dressed in black leather. They're gyrating. They're being smeared with jelly and whipped cream. At one point in the uncensored version, they're all face down on the ground with their asses showing. And then there's another close up of an ass that gets like a basting brush rubbed on it. And then like the last 30 seconds is them like slap wrestling without shirts on, covered in butter and jelly.
That's just some good old fashioned boys will be boys stuff.
Yes.
I don't know what you're talking about, Adam. That doesn't sound homoerotic at all. To me.
Classic UK fun, Adam.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just really in your face, right? It's not what
Yeah.
this Nigel Martin guy was apparently going for.
They had a strategy and they executed it. That's what I'm hearing.
I think that the thing that disturbs me the most about that is that probably the lack of agency of the actual members of the band in that decision-making process is probably the thing. Because like if they were a bunch of young dudes and we're like, yeah, like either we're all super gay and we love to we act like this in our normal life, or this is the image we want to put on, this is what we want to present to the world, then that's good marketing, right? But if it's more like, no, you're going to do this because I think that we can make the most money doing this, I don't know, I'm going to guess they might have not been super comfortable with it at all times, especially a 16-year-old who really doesn't have even the agency to say, yeah, I totally want to do this. That just seems wrong to me, in the same way that like having Britney Spears and like a little baby doll cheerleader outfit is wrong, you know?
I had the same note that it felt very exploitative, and flash forward, whatever it is, 7 years in the future in the US, and you've got Britney Spears basically doing a softcore schoolgirl's fetish video with Hit Me Baby One More Time. And like, yeah, that was okay. Apparently just feels a little odd.
At the time when I was like a 16-year-old boy, I was like, this is pretty awesome. As an adult, I look back and I'm like, where the fuck were her parents?
I know.
What are you thinking? The song is talking about hit me, and then she's dressed like a little tiny baby doll. That's just messed up.
Yeah, it's a little odd.
Just to give the promoters a compliment, though, the name Take That is a great name.
Yes, much better than Kick It.
Yes.
So luckily, that's the last time I have to say Kick It for the rest of the episode. So the video and single are released, and Nigel, their manager, is pitching the band to all the major labels in England, but nobody's biting. So he takes it into his own hands. He mortgages his house and puts the record out on his own newly created label called Dance UK. That first song made it to 82 in the UK charts, and that was enough to grab the attention of RCA, who winds up signing the band in September of 1991. So the gamble paid off. But only a few months into the contract, Robbie is already regretting his decision to get into the band. But with some encouragement from his dad, namely in the form of, think how miserable you'll be if these guys hit it big and you're not there. So Robbie sticks with it.
It's kind of sage advice, actually, in a way.
Pretty good.
Like, you'll kill yourself if these guys are billionaires in a month and you walked away.
Yeah, like, you know, we talked about it on the Leonard Skinner episode. Like, you know, the bass player who decides to leave right before they record pronounced Leonard Skinner. It's like, dude, you would have been set. Your kids and your grandkids would have been set with that money. What were you doing?
It's like
And the bass tone on that record would have been better as well.
Yeah.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would.
So what does a gig schedule look like for an up-and-coming boy band in England in the early 90s? Well, the boys found themselves doing 4 shows a day, partly promoted by the Family Planning Association with the goal of promoting safe sex. Sorry, there's nothing lamer than that. It's an important message, but a super lame message if you're trying to be a pop star.
I mean,
So
at
they're
least they're talking about sex.
Yeah, there you go.
You
Right.
know,
Yeah,
as
that's what
somebody who's
the
probably
kids
below the
wanna
age of
hear.
consent talking about sex. There's nothing wrong with that.
God, you're right. He's 16.
He's
Jesus.
16.
That makes it even worse.
Yeah. I mean, I
Uh.
imagine most 16-year-olds were probably having sex. Not us cool guys, but most
No.
16-year-olds were probably having sex.
So early on at these gigs, Rob starts kind of stealing the show from the older and more experienced guys. And what do I mean by stealing the show? Well, their manager was super militant with their performances. He demanded perfect timing, perfect choreography. Tom, it sounds like this K-pop thing that you're talking about. And he was the kind of guy who just wasn't going to play along. So he was just being himself and screwing around a bit, but that brought personality to the stage. And in May of 1992, the band had their first real big hit with It Only Takes a Minute, which made it all the way up to number 7 in the UK charts, and which we will drop a clip of right here.
I never thought that Milli Vanilli would sound edgy, but Jesus Christ, this song sucks.
It's a little rough.
Yeah, this actually really helped put the Robbie Williams solo record in context of how bad it could be.
Yeah.
This was everything that was wrong with 1992 and why grunge had to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's you have beat every single possible piece of musical credibility out of this type of pop fare at this point. You got to have something different. I mean, I remember the musical landscape when I was like, 11 or 12 in the early 90s, and it was pretty shitty. I remember buying like, Rex and Effects singles for like Rump Shaker and stuff like that. But good Lord, this was pretty lame. Like, this is worse than New Kids on the Block. New Kids on the Block is somehow better than this.
This sounds like a hangover from the synth pop of the 80s into the early 90s. It all just started to sound very dated, even as it was getting released, and it hasn't aged any better.
No,
Yes.
it is aged terribly, absolutely terribly. And I after listening to that, I was like, why didn't he just go, the Marky Mark road and just become a shitty actor instead of becoming a shitty musician? Like, that was probably available for you.
Just pounding creatine and doing push-ups and get into an acting role, and you're set.
Probably didn't want to get up at 3:30 a.m. to do his first workout.
Yeah, Robbie doesn't seem like the type of person who would really be into that. So flash forward about 9 months, and in February of 1993, Take That was the biggest name in British pop. The band was cooking. I mean, business operations were cooking because, again, this is a business. Remember, take as much money, make as much money as possible in the shortest amount of time. And as early as 1993, though, there were already fractures forming in the band. They were supposed to have this manicured, carefully crafted narrative, but Robbie is often cutting loose in the press, revealing that he dropped out of high school. Man, that's a big no-no. He thought the rest of his bandmates were weird. Shouldn't say that. And he thought the leader of the band, Gary, was boring. Boosh. So Robbie is also feeling slighted because Nigel and Gary refuse to listen to any of his ideas, whether it's songs or lyrics or show ideas. He's a pretty creative guy, but he's being forced to kind of stay in his lane. And a few months later, in July of 1993, the band would record their first 2 number ones. So they are clocking. But by this point, we can now add power struggle to the band's woes as well, because Robbie thinks he should be the leader of the band. But he's also secretly embarrassed about how lame they are. In retrospect, looking back, like, he knew at the time, he's like, I hate this. This is the stupidest thing in the world. But he keeps moving with it because it's a paycheck.
He wasn't wrong, though.
Right.
Yeah.
He had some good
Pretty dumb.
insight back then as a 16-year-old.
It is rare that somebody is like, no, I'm too good for this. I need to, spread my wings and fly. And they're right. And it's not like, no, you were just a fucking cog in the machine. And that's what actually was getting you where you needed to be. This is an incredibly favorable comparison for Robbie Williams, but kind of like Beyonce when she was in, what was it, Destiny's Child, and she was like, I'm bigger than this. I need to spread my wings. And at the time, it was like, Destiny's Child, but on top of the world. What are you doing being
Right.
that? And you're like, oh, that's what
I
you were
see it.
doing. Okay, yeah.
So Rob, like we said, is constantly going awry of all of these rules set out by management. He's getting drunk. He's sleeping with groupies. He's doing things that would appear quite normal for a 20-year-old mega star. And the leader of the band, Gary, according to Rob, was super lame. And Rob started building this animosity towards him. Gary was getting the most royalties, mainly because he'd written most of the material. He'd recently purchased a house. He had a sensible car. He bragged that he was good at paying bills and saving money. Gary was never going to be found in a hotel room with a hooker and a bag of Coke. And that was a problem for Robbie. He thought that that's what the band needed. He wanted to be like Keith Richards and live that rock and roll lifestyle.
While singing songs that are synth pop schlock. It's like, yes, I need to get my inner Keith Richards out while I sing, "Ooh, baby."
Now, you could probably argue that he had been practicing for this rock star role his whole life, right? He had been drinking since his early teens when the bartenders would slip him drinks at his dad's gigs. He was smoking weed, taking speed in high school. He started doing coke in their first arena tour in 1994. And increasingly, Robbie was staying out late at the clubs, drinking, dyeing his hair, getting tattoos. And Nigel, the manager, is losing his mind. He'd created the biggest pop act in the UK, aside from the Beatles, and Robbie was threatening to destroy it, was threatening to destroy an act that had done 80 million pounds in album sales in only 3 years.
Whew.
Yeah. So in 1995, things are really falling apart. Rob had wrecked his voice from all the drinking and smoking and all-night benders of coke and ecstasy, but that wasn't really a problem because by the time their third album came around, he wasn't really singing on any of the tracks. So continue more animosity. Look, Robbie wants to be the Rolling Stones. He wants to be a rock star, but he's caught in a pop band and he has this built-in defiant personality. So every time management says do something, he does the exact opposite. And speaking of rock stars, in June of 1995, there was a little underground folk festival called Glastonbury. And there was a small band performing there called Oasis. Now, Robbie is a bona fide star at this point and manages to get backstage with Noel and Liam and the rest of the band and parties with them. Now, Jeff, kind of to what you said, Oasis were not just stars, but they were in your face. They were rock and roll, a little bit of sleaze, right? Everything Robbie wanted to be. So he's trying to ingratiate himself into this scene. And there's this really pivotal moment in his career at Glastonbury. 3 songs into Oasis's set, Liam invited Robbie Williams on stage. Now, Robbie didn't sing or anything. I think he came on stage and maybe flexed his arms or something. But that evening, Robbie partied hard with Oasis. And he's photographed drunk out of his mind, falling all over the place. And in an interview in Enemy in 2022, he said that it's there that he started his new life. He said,
to be fair, Glastonbury, he was getting on stage in front of like 250,000 people.
Insane.
Yeah.
Insane amount.
I'm sure Take That was not filling those kind of numbers out.
They were not. So he said, quote, "I set off with a flute full of champagne and a pocket full of cocaine, ready to get insane in the membrane. And I went to Glastonbury to begin what I didn't know was to be the start of my new life." Yes, he said insane in the membrane. Oh,
Well, even his
so
quotables are so dated to the 90s.
Listen, I just recently listened to Insane in the Brain, and it's a fucking good song. That's a pretty good song. It moves.
All right, so you got to remember too that this is a time when Glastonbury is a rock festival and there's this militant indiness in the air. And he was in a pop boy band, and a lot of people considered that a lower art form. It would be the equivalent of Dave Grohl in the 90s asking Joey Fatone from NSYNC to come hang out on stage. So this whole spectacle was a very deliberate move. He wanted to be seen out away from his pop band, hanging out with the rockers. And in the weeks after his Glastonbury visit, the band was preparing for a 20-date tour through the UK, which had a fat £1 million paycheck at the end of it for Robbie. But by this point as well, Robbie's a full-blown addict and alcoholic, and he's getting wasted before rehearsals just to make it through with a group of people that he hates. So roughly a month later, in July of 1995, Robbie Williams leaves Take That, the biggest pop act at the time. Now, Robbie claims that the band sat him down during a rehearsal and told him that they were now a 4-piece. Boosh. The band says that Robbie decided to leave, and they implored him to take some time to think it over, but that it was him that left. Either way, Robbie is out of the band, and immediately heads to Saint-Tropez, where he parties with George Michael, who, if you recall, managed to eke out a meager living after his band Wham.
Yeah.
So there's some similarities there.
Hey,
Now
Wham
that-
was way better than Take That, though, right?
Well,
I'm no Wham
I know.
lover, but I mean, they had
Yeah, I
some
know.
good
Yeah, so-
tunes.
I'll give you that. Now that leaves us with a young Robbie Williams. He's only 21. He's a megastar. He just walked away from a £1 million payday for that upcoming tour. He's befriended arguably the biggest rock band in the world at the time. What could possibly go wrong?
Ooh,
And that,
drugs? Is it drugs?
that is the perfect spot for our favorite segment, By the Numbers. All right, so here we go. We're starting off with the number 7, as in 7 out of 10. That's the rating that NME gave today's album, Life Through a Lens, saying Robbie's newfound self-consciousness makes for a solo album that is often sharp, smart, and prickling with personality far beyond the call of teen pop duty.
Clearly not Robert Christgau writing that one.
It was definitely, I don't think Robert Christgau would have, I should have checked.
I'm already softening a little bit because it's all about where they're coming from. That's how this album has to be taken, right? The context of what this dude is known for and then what comes out.
Right. You said it better than I could. I'm going to grab that and put it at the end for my final, my final pitch. All right. The next number is 75, as in 75 million. That's total albums sold by Robbie Williams globally to date.
Oh my gosh.
He's doing all right for himself.
Did you say 70 million? So is that the number?
75 million.
Wow. Right up there with the
Yeah.
Monkees, as I recall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our next number is 19 million. That is the total albums sold globally by Take That between 1990 and 1995. Not too shabby either.
And we're not counting that in Robbie's total, or are we?
We are counting that in his total.
Oh,
all right.
bullshit.
All right. Forget it. I take back everything nice I said.
All right. Tom, you mentioned drugs at the start of the segment. Our next number is 30. It's in 30 quid. Rob had an encounter with a reformed English gangster who had found God. And that is not the punchline or the start of a joke. But in the waning days of his time with Take That, Rob was partying in Ibiza, Spain, and had a drink called a Poco Loco, which included a mixture of mescaline, acid, and ecstasy. While on this mixture, he went to see the leader of the band, Gary Barlow. When Gary opened the door, Robbie raised his hands and said, "I've found God," and then collapsed and slept for 48 straight hours. But that experience will only run you about 30 pounds. So next time you're in Ibiza.
And astute listeners will realize that Adam only brought that up so that he could mention the band Poco.
I gotta get my hits in at some point, man. All right, our next number is the number 4. This album, Life Through a Lens, produced 4 top 10 singles in the UK. Next up, 1.4, as in 1.4 million. That's the copies of this album sold in the first 15 months after its release in September of 1997. The number 1000 is up next. When local Hamburg radio station Enjoy announced that Robbie had left Take That, they received over 1,000 phone calls, many from teenage girls threatening suicide. It was a big deal, all right?
Wow.
Man,
And
the 90s sucked.
Well, is it similar when if Harry Styles broke up One Direction? I don't know if he's responsible for that, or JT broke up NSYNC.
yeah, I think it was a pretty big deal. I mean, it was like there were constantly young girls who would like go stand outside of Robbie Williams' mother's flower shop, just like waiting day after day in hopes that her son would just walk into the flower store. Like it was pandemonium on Robbie Williams.
Well, I keep mentioning the Monkees episode, which was a few weeks ago, because I think there is a relationship. But one of the things we learned in that history was Beatlemania was a thing. And then the Beatles stopped making pop music or touring, but the mania was still out there. Teenagers needed to scream at someone
About something.
And I think that's continued through the decades.
Yeah, but what a precipitous slide. If you go from the Beatles on down to this. No offense, take that. Actually, offense, take
Offense,
that.
a little
Yes,
bit of
Yeah, right.
offense.
a little bit
Offense
of
intended.
offense.
Well, if you look at the history of that mania, that actually goes all the way back to Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and Elvis. Yeah, they all
Yeah,
had
Elvis,
hordes
yeah.
of screaming girls. You know, so
That's true.
it's not a Beatlemania thing. It's just a teenage fan mania,
Yeah.
and
It's
it's always present.
It's true, and I think those early artists were good. Their managers, in particular, were good at stoking those flames. Like I remember reading that for Sinatra, for maybe some of the earlier gigs, they paid women to come and swoon, but then it just started happening on its own. It started rolling from there, you know?
Yes, yes, yes.
They weren't super into like a short, angry alcoholic who chain smoked. That wasn't they were just immediately into him. He's got striking eyes, don't get me wrong, but
This is, you got to remember that Sinatra had a whole phase in his 20s, and then the Sinatra we kind of know is post 40. That's where what he's most famous for. That was his comeback.
sure.
All right, and our last number is 550, as in 550 million. That is the number of online streams for Angels on Spotify alone. It's a lot of listens. All right, so that wraps up our By the Number segment. But before we jump back into our story, we want to thank each and every one of you for listening. You know that we here at the podcast love learning about music, especially albums and artists like Robbie Williams, who evaded our limited worldview as teenagers in the US in the 90s. And if you're looking for a way to support us here at 1001 Album Complaints, the easiest way to do that would be to join our mailing list. We'll keep you up to date with occasional emails about upcoming episodes, listener polls, and general goings on here at the podcast. So just head to the episode notes and click on Join Our Mailing List link. We'll take care of the rest. All right, so Robbie is out of the band. What to do next? Well, Robbie's mom, Jan, knew that her son was miserable. And just prior to his leaving Take That, she reached out to a guy named Kevin Kinsella, who was an indie record label boss. She hinted that her son would likely be leaving Take That and asked if Kinsella could be his manager and help him through this transition. Kinsella agrees, and after Robbie's return from partying with George Michael in France, Robbie has a complete mental breakdown and spends a couple weeks on Kinsella's couch, hiding from the paparazzi, who, by the way, are monsters.
Yeah,
Yes,
that is
especially the British ones.
the British ones. I think are even worse than the U.S. ones. Is my understanding, right?
And they talked in the book about the pattern or the formula of finding the hot young next thing and blowing them up and putting them on every magazine and making them look great and praising them and just waiting for the crack and then tearing them down. And it's this life cycle in, UK pop scene that was just crazy at the time and continues today.
Frankly, being a pop star sounds terrible at that level. We've talked about this before. At that level of fame, that seems terrible. Not quite to Michael Jackson. I have to hire people to go grocery shopping in a store so I feel like a normal person. But if you just can't leave your house without your picture being taken or people wanting to talk to you, I frankly would lose my goddamn mind if that happened.
Yeah.
There's no way I could handle that.
Well, that did actually happen to Robbie Williams because he developed agoraphobia. He couldn't leave his house because he was scared
Yeah.
of people taking his photo. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Like, I look like shit most of the time. I don't want that being documented.
Seems unlikely at this point in your life, Tom. So
Pretty
I
unlikely.
wouldn't
I
worry
think
too
we're
much
in the
about it.
clear.
Yeah.
We're
If
all
I'm
in the
getting
clear.
documented, it's like the FBI or something like that. It's not the
Oh,
tabloids.
certainly they have a file. Let's be honest.
It's not people. All right. Meanwhile, so Kinsella's first thought is that he had to get Robbie out of his Take That contract with RCA. And Robbie was in a pretty terrible mental state and was drunk daily, pretty drugged up as well. Kinsella said that he was going through 2 bottles of vodka a day. Look, Robbie had been a famous pop star since he was 16, living a fake life. He missed out on his youth. And now that he was out of it, he didn't know who he was or what to do. Every aspect of his life was planned out. Even if he routinely broke away to go party, he never had to think about normal life, normal stuff, groceries, laundry, car payments. He's out of that life and he doesn't know how to be a real person. And this was a fun side note about his manager I saw. So if you need a manager, find one who does this. When asked by the press about Robbie's blatant and public drug and alcohol problem, Kinsella told the press, "To my knowledge, he has never touched anything, not even aspirin." So, but
Wow.
later on, once he broke away from Robbie, the same manager said this: Rob had absolutely nothing to say if he wasn't pissed, drunk. He was known as the cheeky fun one and Take That, always joking, but to be honest, he was incredibly dull to be around. He was a very boring man. He had very few interests. His whole life was showbiz or the things that go with it. His life was just totally shallow. That's what you get
Well,
when you grow up from 16 to 21 in a band like that.
yeah, and I mean, even what you're talking about, the guy who was sort of defending him and sticking up for him was like, "Oh no, I was only doing that for the money. Fuck this guy."
Right.
As soon as he's not getting paid,
Right,
which is,
right.
Yeah.
It's almost like showbiz is full of fake people, fake friends.
So Robbie's flailing around a bit. He tries to record some of his own material in his manager's Manchester studio, but according to Kinsella, it's all shit. So what's a boy to do? Well, Robbie decides to really embrace the Playboy lifestyle, and he moves to London, where he is partying every night, going hard on the party scene. He heads to London, takes all of his problems with him, and gains 45 pounds while he's staying in London. He is a mess. In fact, another record producer saw him out partying, called Kinsella and said, "Get your boy out of London or he's going to be dead in a couple months."
I have to say, it's kind of impressive for somebody who reportedly had a cocaine problem to drink enough to be able to gain 45 pounds. That is impressive.
I'm sure he's eaten some stuff too. So,
Probably not a ton.
oh yeah, you're right. Not a lot of cocaine. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Rob's mother eventually gets fed up with not Robbie, but Kinsella's inability to control Robbie. So they fire him. And they get another guy named Tim Abbott, who was a marketing guy at the Oasis record label, but had never managed a major act. And despite spending much of his time keeping Robbie alive and clothed, because there's a couple stories where Robbie would get naked and literally jump out of hotel windows onto the street. This guy, the new manager, Abbott, is courting EMI. But due to a lost legal battle, Robbie can't get out. Robbie can't get out of his RCA contract, and no labels are willing to buy it out. And then on Robbie's 22nd birthday, the rest of Take That officially disbands, albeit on much better terms. But that's not a good thing, because that leaves every member of Take That with RCA. So RCA now has a pecking order of artists that they're going to put up to the top. So you've got the lead guy, Gary, who's got a single ready to go. Mark Owen, another guy from Take That, he's kind of second. So Robbie is obviously at the very bottom of when he's able to actually release any material that he's writing. But now in June of 1996, Robbie does get some good news. Just shy of 1 year after his breakup with the band, RCA releases Robbie and he signs a 1.5 million pound deal with an EMI offshoot called Chrysalis. Now, EMI did wind up paying 800,000 pounds to RCA to buy out their contract with Robbie.
Damn.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a big matzo ball out there. What?
It's a spicy
Like,
meatball.
At the spicy the big fish and chip? I don't know. In late July of 1996, Robbie releases his first single, a cover of George Michael's Freedom. Robbie really didn't want to do it, but Chrysalis wanted him to get something out ASAP, and they figured, what better song than Freedom? Funny enough, in the video that accompanied his cover version, he was actually lip syncing to the original because he hadn't yet recorded his own version. That's how
Wow.
that's how things work out. The record company's like, no, you're going to be doing this. Go record the video. We'll worry about the music later.
Doesn't sound like they worry too much about the music. Listening to it. It's not very good.
That is true. Right. It's just funny because Robbie wanted to carve out a new niche for himself, but instead he winds up copying another guy who also escaped a boy band and started a solo career. So it didn't do too well. Now, the label wants him to start making some more material. Obviously, they bought it. They bought him out of that contract. They want to start getting some money from him. So the label flies him down to Miami, Florida to work with Desmond Child. And that name might sound familiar because that was from our Bon Jovi episode. Desmond Child was a professional singer-songwriter / hitmaker, and he co-wrote 4 songs on that Slippery When Wet album. And so Robbie heads there to work with Child, and Robbie hates the experience because basically he described Desmond Child as right to order. So he would just go on, I need a hit, and this guy would write it, and Robbie wasn't involved. And out of that comes the song Old Before I Die, which you'll probably recognize as the Oasis clone song on this album that Robbie also hates.
Wow. Can we say that Desmond Child's other writing credits include Livin' La Vida Loca?
Oh my goodness.
A hit maker, my God.
Oh, sorry. And Aerosmith's Dude Looks Like a Lady.
Oh, okay.
Jesus.
Okay. It's a pretty big come down from Living La Vida Loca. I gotta be honest.
Aw. All right. So one day, shortly after they finish the fake Oasis song, Robbie receives a call that no one wants to get. The most dreaded call in show business, a call from Elton John. It was not a call to say, hey, let's collaborate. It was a call to say, you've hit rock bottom and you need rescuing.
Damn.
Rob had been to an Elton John party the year prior and had made a complete ass out of himself by literally throwing up in front of everyone at the party and Elton John. So I think word made it around to Elton that Robbie was in dire straits, and Robbie winds up spending some time.
I think he was in Take That, Adam. Sorry, you messed that up.
That's good. That's good.
Robbie winds up staying at Elton John's house for a couple weeks to get cleaned up, and he headed to an addiction and rehab doctor that Elton John had used. So Robbie gets clean. He addresses his inner demons, and by clean, I mean he's still drinking, but less. So maybe that's a win. I don't know.
Can we give it to Elton John, though? I mean, he apparently has been quite good at being that voice of reason after his sobriety to other people that were like,
yeah.
I know he was like Eminem's NA sponsor to get him off of the prescription drugs that he was on and stuff. So he seems like actually kind of a really great dude when it comes to that stuff. He's like, I did this. It fucking sucks. It's hard to get off of it. I will share my experience with you. Come live at my chalet while you get clean. That's a great dude.
Yeah. Pretty
Yeah.
cool. All right. In October of 1996, I swear we're getting close to the album here. In October of 1996, Robbie fires his manager, Tim Abbott, who then promptly sues him, making him the third manager who he is in court battling at the time. Robbie eventually winds up in the office of 2 guys named Tim Clark and David Entevin, who are 2 hippies who got their start at Island Records. They take on Robbie. They listen to some of his demos. They said that they suck, but he's a pretty competent lyricist. So they decided what he really needed was somebody who could help him orchestrate and write the songs. Enter Guy Chambers, fellow Englishman and musical savant who had been writing music since he was 12, playing music professionally since he was 15. And he was about 12 years older than Robbie at this point. And as a guitarist and keyboard player, Clark and Entevin thought that this writing duo actually had a chance of making something great. But Guy Chambers is no dummy. He's obviously seeing the tabloids and he sees how Robbie is an insane drug addict. So he's not thrilled with the idea initially, but the 2 finally meet. They've got a lot of chemistry. And that finally brings us to tonight's album. So they start writing and recording for this debut in March of 1997. The two get together and in the first 20 minutes of their first session, they write South of the Border, which is on this album as well. They write 3 more songs on that first day. I see Rob giggling because...
Well, first of all, I think someone else wrote South of the Border years and years ago. So you're not really starting off on the great foot here.
Did I get that one wrong?
No, it's just the same as an old
That
song
south
title.
of the border, down
Oh,
Mexico way.
right.
Yeah.
And you make fun of me for knowing Mork and Mindy. All right. So the next day they got together, they wrote the song Angels. And Robbie has some songs that are lying in wait, but he releases Old Before I Die as a single. Again, it's that Oasis clone song, which Noel Gallagher later taunted Robbie Williams about, calling him a fat karaoke singer.
So
Now,
fucking Noel.
oh, Old Before I Die was the official lead single, peaked at #2 in the UK. Never far from the spotlight, though, is Robbie's struggles with addiction. Rob does eventually hit rock bottom when he sees a picture of himself in the tabloids that shocks even him. So he decides to enter Cloud's House, a rehab clinic in Wiltshire, England, in June, 2 months after the release of this first single. So this time around, rehab is a success for a couple weeks. And then Rob is back into the booze and drugs while recording the album. Both Guy Chambers, his writing partner, and Steve Power, the producer, said they had a hell of a time keeping Robbie sober enough to make it through the recording process. Steve Power, the producer, was initially hesitant to work with Robbie, kind of thought Robbie was a joke, a washed up pop star, but after hearing them perform Angels, he was on board.
This is one of the things that it's not that I don't get it. I get why, but every recording project I've ever embarked in has been an uphill battle to try to get it done. And then you get these people. Robbie Williams doesn't seem particularly talented to me. Why is he being fighting tooth and nail through this process? We're like, we just got to get him to the other side so we can put this fucking record out. Like, is he really that big
It's
of a star?
It's because name recognition is everything in the business. That's it. That's why they keep making sequels to movies that we've heard before or buying up IP. There's no other reason.
The Robbie Williams brand was always going to be worth money all the way from the very start.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Makes it really hard for me to give him a ton of credit for this, though. If they're like, we wrote a bunch of songs, then we had to drag his ass into the studio and be like, can you just fucking please record a vocal? Just please record a vocal today. Like, no. Like, oh, come on.
Well, I guess we're going to... Go ahead, Jeff.
Guy Chambers deserves the credit for the songwriting. I think he was the musician in the room, but yes, Robbie Williams was the I'm going to say talent in inverted commas, but he was the brand.
Yeah,
he was the brand that Guy Chambers put on the music. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm surprised, Adam, that you missed a chance to mention Philadelphia area band The Hooters, because I noticed
Bazillion
Eric Bazillion of The Hooters gets a writing credit on that song as well. Somehow, some way. I don't know if you know the story there. But I also noticed that with the biggest hit song, Angels, it said, this is just from Wikipedia, so you tell me, Adam, it said based on an earlier song by another songwriter, which they then bought the rights to, which sounds like some kind of strong arm tactic.
Yeah. So the story we'll get into that. Well, I'll tell it now. So the story goes that Robbie was out of Take That and he had gotten drunk at a bar, and the guy who wrote it had just lost his kid or something like that, like some terrible tragedy. And so he had written Angels. He runs into Robbie Williams in a bar and says, look, I just wrote this song. Do you want to hear it? Robbie hears it. They go up, they collaborate a little bit. Flash forward a couple years, Robbie presents the song, and then, they approach the original writer and give him, I think, £7,500 to relinquish any claims to the intellectual property that is the song. So,
Talk about a poor financial decision, right?
Right.
That's a guy who doesn't understand branding.
Right.
Yeah. Kicking a guy when he's down too. Like, hey, you can buy a lot of booze for $7,500. Probably take some of that pain away.
I just feel like it would be so within the bounds of normalcy to just include him as a writer on the song. So many pop songs have so many writer credits on them. Just cut up that pie, even if you only gave him 10%, to go and, I'm speculating, squeeze him for the rights seems morally questionable.
Yeah.
Wait.
I
In
think there was a certain amount of Robbie Williams having something to prove, and he wanted to prove that he could write a good song, so he wanted his name on it, and he wanted to buy out the other guy.
Yeah.
That
It was
didn't.
it was all about image. It was
He
all
wasn't.
about proving his point.
He didn't know we'd have the internet. I guess.
But it also sounds like he, maybe not strong armed him, but used just how charming and how much of a pop star he was. Cause I think he said when he went to the guy's house, he like surprised him and they were sitting in the living room and the guy's family like came downstairs, like, oh, who's at the front door? And here's Robbie Williams sitting on their couch. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
God. So of course.
It's an unequal power dynamic, right? So it's
Total.
inherently exploitive, I think.
Yeah.
But okay.
Like, we're in mourning. We recently lost a child. Oh, there's a coked out pop star sitting on our couch. This is exactly the kind of energy we want to bring to this period of solemn mourning that we're going through.
All right, so there's not a lot of specifics on the actual recording sessions, but Robbie was known to freak out in the studio, hide under the mixing console because he was super uncomfortable being in the studio. According to the producer Steve Power in a 2022 podcast interview, he said Robbie hated being in the studio. He wasn't at all interested in the production or the engineering side of things. He just wanted to write. He was remarkably impatient. He only came in to sing. And on his follow-up album, he would ask his producer to keep his vocal sessions under an hour per day.
Wow.
That's a dick move right there. I'm not really selling it at this point.
No, you're not. You're really not.
Yeah.
It sounds like pop music made by the machine to me.
Honestly, it sounds like fucking karaoke. It sounds like they're like, hey, this is a karaoke song you haven't heard before, but here's the basic melody. Why don't you sing that? And yeah, we'll have you write a couple of lines. What's that old adage, change a word, earn a third? They talk about, all these people like a Kesha or something like that will come in and the song will be 99% written. And they're like, how about there? Instead of saying last Friday night, we say this Friday night. And it's not even the hook or anything like that. And they're like, yeah, great. You are now a writer on this song.
Right. All right. So in order to get decent vocal performances out of Robbie because he hated being there, Steve Power would often invite attractive young women into the studio to sit in the control room, and Robbie would just naturally show off a bit. And that's how they got at least some personality on the tape. Now, the album was released in September of 1997. Just 2 months later, it had only sold 30,000 copies. Handful of singles released off the album failed to really lift it into any prominence, and by December, it had all but faded away and landed at number 104 in the UK charts. Now, the folks over at Chrysalis Records are freaking out because they paid £800,000 just to get Robbie out of his prior contract, and now this long-awaited solo album from the bad boy of pop was bombing. And as the year drew to a close, people close to Rob were sure the label was going to drop him. But that all changed with the fourth single that was released. That was the song Angels, and it was released on December 1st. Now, the book I read posits that maybe it was the holidays, maybe it was the mood of the nation having just lost Princess Diana 3 months earlier. Regardless, the song Angels takes off.
That was the advice that Elton John gave him, by the way. You got to take advantage of this tragedy.
Candle in the Wind, 94 or whatever it was. Ugh. All right, so by the end of January 1998, his debut had sold 210,000 copies, and a month later, the Angels single had sold 600,000 copies alone. So, cemented in British pop culture as a huge album and a huge single. Now, what do you say we jump into some tracks?
I'd say that sounds pretty good.